There's nothing quite like watching your life's work burn to the ground while you stand helpless in the darkness. For Jed Carter, that moment came when the Outlaws rode away from his smoldering cabin, leaving behind 63 years of memories turned to ash. The old mountain man had built that home with his own hands in the Colorado peaks, and now it was gone. The night riders figured they'd broken his spirit along with everything he owned. But they didn't know about Boone, his loyal dog who refused to give up. 3 days later, that faithful hound started digging where the hearth used to be. What he found buried there was a secret worth more than all the cattle in the territory. The Outlaws thought they'd destroyed everything, but they were wrong about one thing. What happens when a man loses everything but discovers he's richer than he ever imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and amber, just as it had for the past 63 years of Jed Carter's life. Before the fire, before the riders, before everything changed, this had been his sanctuary, his cabin. Sat nestled in a grove of towering pines, 8,000 feet above sea level, where the air was thin enough to make a man appreciate every breath he drew. Jed had built that cabin with his own hands when he was barely 20, using nothing but an axe, a saw, and the kind of determination that only comes from knowing you found your place in the world. Every log had been chosen carefully, every notch carved with precision. The foundation stones came from the creek bed below, hauled up the mountain one by one on his back. The roof shingles were split from cedar he'd felled himself, weathered now to a silver grey that matched his beard. In his gnarled hands he held the walking stick he'd carved from mountain ash during his first winter alone. The wood was smooth now from decades of use, the intricate pattern of leaves and vines still visible despite the wear. It had been his companion on countless walks through these hills, a testament to the patient craftsmanship that defined his way of life. Every morning he'd lean on it while standing on his porch, surveying the valley below with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built something lasting. Boone, his blue-tick hound, would sit beside him during these morning rituals. The dog had been with him for 8 years now, ever since Jed had found him as a pup, half-starved and shivering in a snowstorm. They'd understood each other from the first moment. Two creatures who preferred the honest company of mountains to the complicated ways of townfolk. Boone's coat was a patchwork of blue-grey spots over white, his ears long enough to sweep the ground when he put his nose to a scent. But it was his eyes that spoke of intelligence, a deep brown that seemed to hold conversations Jed never needed to voice aloud. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, lay 15 miles down a winding trail that most folks considered too treacherous for regular travel. That suited Jed just fine. He made the journey once a month for supplies, riding his old mule Moses, with Boone trotting alongside. The townspeople knew him as the mountain hermit, though hermit wasn't quite right. He simply chose his company carefully and found that solitude taught a man things that crowds never could. At Murphy's General Store, they'd nod respectfully when he came to trade his carved wooden bowls and walking sticks for coffee, flour, and ammunition. Martha Murphy, the storekeeper's wife, always had a kind word and sometimes a letter that had found its way to him through channels he'd established years ago. The children would peek around corners to catch sight of the legendary mountain man, though he was gentler than his reputation suggested. He'd carved toys for more than one young one over the years, leaving them on doorsteps without fanfare. Doc Henley, the town's physician and closest thing Cedar Falls had to an educated man, was perhaps Jed's only real friend in civilization. They'd share a drink and a chess game whenever Jed came to town, two men who understood that wisdom often came wrapped in silence. Doc never asked too many questions about Jed's past, and Jed never offered more than was necessary. Some stories were better left buried. They both understood. The cabin itself told the story of a life lived deliberately. One room served as kitchen, dining and sitting area, with a stone fireplace that Jed had built to draw perfectly, never smoking, even in the wildest mountain storms. His bed occupied one corner, simple but well made, covered with quilts he'd traded for over the years. Shelves lined the walls, holding his small collection of books, mostly practical volumes on farming, hunting and woodworking, but also a well-worn copy of Shakespeare and a leather-bound Bible that had belonged to his father. The kitchen was organized with military precision. Cast-iron pans hung from wooden pegs, seasoned to perfection and cared for like precious heirlooms. His coffee pot, blackened with age, could brew a cup strong enough to wake the dead. Mason jars lined one shelf, filled with preserves and pickled vegetables from his modest garden. He grew what he could in the short mountain growing season: potatoes, onions, beans, and hardy greens that could withstand the early frosts. Behind the cabin, a small barn housed Moses the mule and a few chickens that provided eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. Jed had built the structure to withstand the heavy snows that could pile 8 feet deep by February. A root cellar dug into the hillside kept his food stores cool through the summer and from freezing in the winter. Every element of his homestead served a purpose, nothing wasted, everything maintained with the care of a man who understood that up here, preparation meant survival. His father had taught him that lesson, among many others. Jacob Carter had been a different kind of man. Restless, where Jed was steady; ambitious, where Jed was content. Jacob had spent Jed's childhood chasing dreams across the territory, dragging his young son from mining camp to cattle ranch to railroad construction. It was only in his final years that the elder Carter had seemed to find some peace, settling near Cedar Falls and working as a blacksmith. But even then, there had been secrets in his eyes, stories he'd never quite told. On his deathbed, Jacob had gripped Jed's hand with surprising strength and whispered about something hidden, something valuable that belonged to the Carter family by right. His words had been fever-touched and rambling, speaking of silver in the ground and justice denied. Jed had assumed it was the delirium of a dying man, the final regrets of someone who'd spent a lifetime searching for the fortune that always seemed just out of reach. Now, as Jed sat in the ashes of his former life, those whispered words took on new meaning. His father's walking stick, the one carved with such care, lay charred and broken among the ruins. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. One generation's craftsmanship destroyed, but perhaps another generation's legacy about to be revealed. The morning he'd first brought Boone home, the pup had shown an unusual interest in the area around the fireplace. Jed had attributed it to the sense of cooking and warmth, but looking back now, he wondered if the dog had sensed something else entirely. Animals, especially dogs with bloodlines bred for tracking, sometimes knew things that escaped human awareness. Boone had always been exceptional, even among hounds known for their intelligence. He could read weather changes hours before they arrived, leading Jed to safety when storms threatened. He'd alerted to wildlife that could pose a threat: mountain lions, bears, the occasional pack of coyotes that grew too bold. But more than that, Boone seemed to understand Jed's moods, offering silent companionship when grief struck and playful distraction when melancholy threatened to take hold. The bond between them had deepened during the harsh winter of Jed's 60th year, when pneumonia had nearly claimed the old mountain man's life. For 2 weeks, Boone had never left his side, somehow managing to keep the fire burning, and even bringing small game within reach when Jed was too weak to hunt. Doc Henley, when he'd finally made it up the treacherous winter trail, had marveled at the dog's devotion and intelligence. "That hound of yours has more sense than half the men in Cedar Falls," Doc had said, scratching Boone behind the ears. "You're lucky to have found each other." But luck, Jed was beginning to understand, might not have been the only force at work in his life. As he contemplated the ruins of his cabin and the mystery that lay buried beneath, he wondered what other forces had been shaping his path. His father's cryptic final words, Boone's strange behavior around the hearth, even his own stubborn decision to build his home in this particular spot. Perhaps none of it had been as random as he'd believed. The mountains had taught him patience above all else. Weather systems that could kill an unprepared man developed slowly, visible to those who knew how to read the signs. Seasons changed according to their own rhythm, not according to human desires for convenience. Even the trees grew according to patterns that might take decades to fully reveal themselves. Now, at 63, Jed was beginning to understand that some of life's most important lessons required the same patient observation. Standing in the ruins of his former life, leaning on a borrowed walking stick from Doc Henley's collection, Jed felt the weight of transition. The familiar was gone, burned to ash and scattered by mountain winds. But something new was emerging from those ashes, something that connected him to his father's legacy in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Boone sat beside him, patient, as always, but with an alertness that suggested the dog sensed changes coming. The hound's nose occasionally lifted to test the air, not for immediate threats, but for subtler scents that might carry information about their altered world. In the 3 days since the fire, Boone had been restless during their temporary shelter. In town, always eager to return to this spot, always drawn to the area where their home had once stood. Perhaps, Jed thought, it was time to listen more carefully to what his faithful companion was trying to tell him. The mountains had taught him to pay attention to signs that others might miss. Maybe it was time to apply that wisdom to the mystery his father had tried to leave behind. The night they came, Jed was reading by lamplight, his father's old Bible open to a passage in Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. The irony of those words wouldn't strike him until much later, when he understood that his season of quiet solitude was ending and a time for reckoning had begun. Boone's ears pricked up first, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he rose from his place by the fire. The dog's hackles raised, and he moved to the window with the fluid alertness of a predator sensing danger. Jed set down the worn leather Bible, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung above the mantel. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, he heard what had alerted his faithful companion, the distant thunder of hoofbeats on the mountain trail. Too many horses moving too fast for any honest purpose at this hour. Through the window, Jed could see torches bobbing in the darkness like malevolent fireflies. A dozen riders, maybe more, winding their way up the narrow path that led to his cabin. No neighbor would approach with such numbers, and no lawman would come calling with torches instead of lanterns. These were night riders, and they brought trouble with them. The Bible fell from his lap as he stood, and it landed open to a page he'd marked years ago. A pressed flower from his mother's garden still lay between the pages, dried to brittleness, but somehow preserved. The sight of it steadied him, reminding him of gentle hands and Sunday morning lessons about courage in the face of adversity. "Easy, Boone," he murmured, checking the loads in his rifle. 6 shots, and if his count was right, at least 12 men approaching. The mathematics of the situation weren't in his favor, but mathematics had never been the most important factor in a mountain man's survival. The riders emerged from the tree line like shadows given substance, their faces hidden beneath the brims of dark hats. The man in the lead sat his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Even in the flickering torchlight, Jed could see the quality of his clothes, not the rough garb of common outlaws, but the tailored vest and coat of a man with money and position. "Jed Carter," the leader called out, his voice carrying the educated accent of someone who'd never had to scrape for a living. "Come out where we can see you. We've got business to discuss." Jed stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled in his arms, but not yet raised in an overtly threatening manner. Boone flanked him, a low growl continuing to vibrate in the dog's throat. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the acrid smell of the torches. "Kind of late for social calls," Jed replied evenly. "Most folks with legitimate business come calling during daylight hours." The leader urged his horse closer, and in the better light from Jed's lamp, more details became visible. He was a man in his 50s, well-fed and soft around the edges, in the way that came from years of having others do his physical labor. His eyes, however, were hard as flint, and the smile on his face never reached them. "My name is Marcus Webb," the man said, as if the name should carry weight. "Perhaps you've heard of me in town. I own the largest ranch in the county, among other interests." Jed had indeed heard the name whispered in conversations that stopped when he entered Murphy's store. Webb was rumored to be a man who got what he wanted through methods that didn't always bear close examination. Cattle that wandered onto his land had a tendency to stay there, and small ranchers who opposed his expansion sometimes found their wells mysteriously poisoned or their barns accidentally burned. "Can't say I have," Jed lied smoothly. "What brings you up my mountain this time of night, Mr. Webb?" Webb's smile widened, but it carried all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. "Your mountain, you say? That's interesting. See, according to my research, this land has some disputed claims on it. Claims that go back quite a few years to some mining rights that were never properly resolved." The mention of mining rights sent a chill through Jed that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His father's deathbed whispers echoed in his memory, something about silver in the ground and justice denied. But he kept his expression neutral, giving away nothing of the sudden racing of his heart. "My father filed a homestead claim on this land 30 years ago, Jed said carefully. "Everything legal and proper, recorded in the county seat." "Oh, I'm sure he did," Webb replied, his tone suggesting that legal and proper were concepts that could be interpreted in various ways. But homestead claims can be complicated things, especially when they conflict with prior mining rights. Rights that some people might have forgotten about over the years. One of Webb's men shifted in his saddle, and Jed caught the glint of a pistol butt protruding from the man's coat. These weren't the usual ranch hands that Webb employed for legitimate business. These were hired guns, men who solved problems with lead and fire. Even if that were true, Jed said, his grip tightening slightly on his rifle, it would be a matter for lawyers and courts, not midnight visits from armed men. Webb laughed, but the sound was devoid of humor. "Lawyers and courts cost money, Mr. Carter, time too. Sometimes it's more efficient to handle these matters directly, especially when we're dealing with reasonable men who can see the wisdom of avoiding unnecessary complications." The threat was clear enough, wrapped though it was in polite language. Webb wanted Jed off his land, and he was prepared to use force to make it happen. But there was something else in the man's manner, an urgency that suggested this wasn't just about claiming disputed territory. Webb knew something, or suspected something, that made this particular piece of mountain property valuable enough to risk a confrontation. "And if I'm not feeling particularly reasonable tonight?" Jed asked. Webb's expression hardened, and he raised his hand in a gesture that his men clearly recognized. Torches moved closer, forming a rough circle around the cabin. The message was unmistakable. Jed was outnumbered and surrounded. "Then we'd be forced to consider other options," Webb said. "See, I've got a dozen witnesses here who'd swear they saw you drawing down on us first. Self-defense is a powerful legal concept, especially when respectable citizens are forced to protect themselves from dangerous mountain hermits." Boone's growl deepened, and Jed could feel the tension coiling in the dog's muscles. His faithful companion was reading the situation with the same instincts that had kept them both alive through 8 years of mountain dangers. "There's a third option," Webb continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a final offer. "You pack up your belongings, take that mongrel of yours, and find somewhere else to make your home. I'll even provide transportation to wherever you want to go, and enough money to get you started fresh. All I want is this land, fair and square." "And what's so special about this particular patch of mountain?" Jed asked. Though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer, Webb's eyes glittered in the torchlight. "Let's just say I have reason to believe this property might have some untapped potential. Mineral rights can be valuable things when they're properly developed." There it was, confirmation that Webb knew about the mining claims Jed's father had whispered about. Somehow, word had gotten out about whatever Jacob Carter had hidden up here, And men like Webb had long memories when it came to opportunities for profit. "Afraid I'll have to decline your generous offer," Jed said. "This land has been my home for more than 40 years. I don't plan on leaving it now." Webb's face went cold, all pretense of civility dropping away like a discarded mask. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Carter, truly unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve this matter like civilized men." He turned in his saddle and nodded to his men. "Boys, it appears Mr. Carter has made his choice. Since he's determined to be unreasonable, I suppose we'll have to help him see the error of his ways." The first torch arced through the air before Jed could fully process what was happening. It landed on his porch roof, the dry cedar shingles catching fire with hungry eagerness. More torches followed, thrown with practiced precision at different points around the cabin. "Boone, come!" Jed shouted, realizing that his options had suddenly narrowed to flight or death. He fired once, more to make the riders keep their distance than with any hope of hitting anyone. In the confusion of darkness and flickering light, the dog was already moving, following his master as Jed sprinted for the tree line behind the cabin. More shots rang out, bullets splintering wood and whistling through the air where he'd been standing moments before. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, fed by the dry wood and mountain wind. They reached the cover of the pines, just as the cabin's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flaming debris. Jed turned back to watch his life's work consumed by flames that painted the mountainside in hellish orange light. 43 years of patient craftsmanship reduced to ash and memory in a matter of minutes. Webb's voice carried clearly across the clearing, shouting orders to his men. "Make sure it burns completely. I don't want anything left standing that he might come back to." The Bible, his father's Bible with the pressed flower and all the marginalia accumulated over years of study, was gone. His tools, his furniture, his carefully preserved stores of food and supplies, all of it feeding the hungry flames. But it was more than material possessions being destroyed. It was the physical embodiment of everything he'd built his identity around, the tangible proof of his place in the world. Boone pressed against his leg, offering the only comfort possible in that moment of devastating loss. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, even as their world literally burned around them. In the flickering light of the fire, Jed could see intelligence in those brown eyes, as if Boone understood that this was an ending that was also a beginning. As Webb and his men rode away, their work of destruction complete, Jed remained hidden in the trees with his faithful companion. The fire would burn itself out eventually, leaving nothing but charred timbers and cold ash. But something told him that this wasn't truly an ending. His father's whispered words about hidden silver and denied justice suggested that some stories had chapters yet to be written. The flames died down as the night wore on, but Jed didn't move from his hiding place until he was certain Webb's men were truly gone. When dawn finally broke over the mountains, it revealed the full extent of the destruction. Where his cabin had stood for more than 4 decades, only a blackened foundation remained, still radiating heat from the burned timbers. But in the growing morning light, Jed noticed something that hadn't been visible during the chaos of the fire. The stone hearth, built to withstand the hottest blazes, remained largely intact, and Boone was already moving toward it, nose to the ground, following a scent that the fire couldn't destroy. The Murphy family's spare room smelled of lavender and old wood, a combination that should have been comforting, but only served to remind Jed how far he was from home. Sarah Murphy had insisted he stay with them after Doc Henley brought word of the fire, and her husband, Frank, had backed her up with the quiet authority of a man who'd learned not to argue with his wife's charitable impulses. "You'll stay as long as you need to," Sarah had declared, bustling around the small room and laying out clean linens. No argument about it. That's what neighbors do for each other. Jed sat on the edge of the narrow bed, turning over a small object in his weathered hands. It was all he had left now, a tattered photograph that had been in his shirt pocket when Webb's men came calling. The sepia-toned image showed his father as a younger man, standing beside what appeared to be a mine entrance. Jacob Carter's face wore an expression Jed had rarely seen in life, confidence mixed with something that might have been hope. On the back of the photograph, in his father's careful handwriting, were the words, "Silver Creek Mine, 1847, partnership with M. Webb Sr., 40% share documented." The date was significant. It was the year before Jed was born, when his father would have been full of dreams about striking it rich in the Colorado mountains. Boone lay at Jed's feet, but the dog's usual contentment was absent. Every few minutes, the hound would lift his head and look toward the window that faced the direction of their burned homestead. His ears would prick forward, and a soft whine would escape his throat, as if he were trying to communicate something urgent that human understanding couldn't quite grasp. "I know." "Boy," Jed murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "This isn't home for either of us." But it was more than displacement that troubled Boone. Since arriving at the Murphy house, the dog had shown an increasing restlessness, pacing the small room and sometimes standing at the door with an intensity that spoke of urgent purpose. It was the same behavior Jed had observed when Boone was tracking wounded. Game, single-minded determination, mixed with barely controlled excitement. Sarah appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs and bacon. Her kind face showed the lines that came from raising 5 children and managing a household in a frontier town. But her eyes held the sharp intelligence that made her husband's store one of the most successful businesses in Cedar Falls. "You need to eat something," she said, setting the food on the small table by the window. "If Frank says you haven't touched a bite since Doc brought you to town." "Much obliged, Mrs. Murphy," Jed replied, though his appetite was as absent as his home. "You and Frank are being more than generous." Sarah studied him with the practiced eye of a woman who'd nursed family and neighbors through various crises. "It's not generosity, Mr. Carter. It's what decent people do when one of their own faces trouble. And from what I hear, that trouble has a name. Marcus Webb." The mention of Webb's name caused both Jed and Boone to tense. The dog's hackles raised slightly, and Jed's jaw tightened as he remembered the cold satisfaction in the man's voice as he'd watched the cabin burn. "Frank heard about it at the store," Sarah continued, settling into the room's single chair. "Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves someone like Webb. This isn't the first time he's used fire to settle disputes." "What do you mean?" Jed asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The Henderson Ranch 2 years back. They found reasons to question the family's deed, then offered to buy them out for half what the land was worth. When Tom Henderson refused, his barn burned down, then his house. Amazing how accidents seem to follow Webb around." Jed studied the photograph again, noting details he'd missed before. In the background, barely visible, was another man. The image was too faded to make out facial features, but something about the figure's posture suggested authority. Perhaps a government official or mining supervisor. "Mrs. Murphy," he said carefully, "what do you know about mining claims in this area? Old ones from back in the 40s and 50s? Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Not much directly, but my father used to tell stories. There was quite a bit of silver mining before the big strike-up in Leadville drew everyone away. Lots of small operations, partnerships that sometimes ended badly when the easy silver played out." She paused, studying Jed's face. "Your father was involved in mining, wasn't he?" "I remember Frank mentioning something about Jacob Carter having worked claims before he settled down to blacksmithing. He mentioned some things before he died," Jed admitted, "but I never paid much attention. Figured it was just an old man's memories of dreams that didn't pan out." "Dreams have a way of lingering in families," Sarah said gently. "Sometimes what one generation can't finish, the next one finds a way to complete." Boone suddenly stood and moved to the window, his whole body rigid with alertness. A low whine escaped his throat, not the sound of a dog sensing immediate danger, but rather the vocalization of an animal trying to communicate complex information to his human companion. "He's been like that since we got here," Jed explained, "acting like he needs to be somewhere else, doing something important." Sarah watched the dog with interest. My grandfather always said that hounds know things we don't. Their noses can pick up scents that tell stories, where someone's been, what they've touched, even things that happened days or weeks ago. The comment sparked a memory in Jed's mind. During the fire, when everything was chaos and terror, he'd noticed Boone's behavior wasn't just driven by fear. The dog had seemed almost excited, not about the danger, but about something else entirely. As if the flames had revealed something that had been hidden. "Mrs. Murphy," Jed said slowly, "would it be possible to borrow a shovel? Maybe some tools for clearing debris?" Her eyebrows raised. "You're not thinking of going back there already, are you? It's too dangerous. Those men might still be watching." "I need to see what's left," Jed replied. "And I think Boone needs to show me something." At the mention of his name, the dog turned from the window and looked directly at Jed with an expression that seemed almost human in its intelligence and urgency. Those brown eyes held a message that transcended the normal communication between man and animal. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Frank keeps tools in the back room at the store. But you're not going alone. If Webb's men are still around, you'll need someone watching your back. I appreciate the offer, but I can't ask you folks to—" "You're not asking," Sarah interrupted firmly. "I'm telling." Frank fought in the war, and he didn't come through Antietam just to let a bully like Webb run roughshod over decent people. Besides, that dog of yours isn't the only one who can sense when something important is about to happen. She stood and moved toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Carter, that photograph you've been studying, did your father leave you anything else? Papers, maybe, or something he told you to keep safe?" Jed shook his head. "Just rambling talk about silver and justice. I thought it was fever dreams." "Maybe," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Or maybe your father was trying to tell you something important, and it just took the right circumstances to make the meaning clear." After she left, Jed examined the photograph more carefully. The writing on the back was definitely his father's, but there were other markings he'd missed before, faint pencil lines that might have been a crude map. The lines converged at a point marked with a small X, and below it, barely visible, were the letters HS, Hearthstone. Boone had returned to his position by Jed's feet, but the dog's alertness hadn't diminished. If anything, the animal seemed to sense that decisions were being made, plans forming that would soon require his particular skills. The hound's tail moved in a slow, measured way that Jed had learned to associate with Boone's deepest concentration. Outside the window, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. In a few hours, darkness would provide the cover they'd need to return to the ruins of his homestead. But even in daylight, Jed found his thoughts drawn back to that pile of ash and stone, and to whatever secret his father had tried to preserve there. The photograph seemed to grow heavier in his hands, as if the weight of years and hidden truth were pressing down through the faded image. 40% share in a silver mine, documented partnership with M. Webb Sr., Marcus Webb's father. The implications were staggering if the photograph was telling the truth, but photographs, like memories, could be misleading. It would take more than a faded image and his father's dying words to prove anything. It would take evidence, the kind that might be buried beneath a stone hearth that had survived the flames that destroyed everything else. Jed folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his shirt pocket. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the ruins of his home, whatever justice his father had been denied, the time for uncovering the truth was at hand. And judging by Boone's increasing restlessness, the dog was more than ready to begin the search. The moon hung like a silver coin against the black velvet sky as Jed, Frank Murphy, and Boone made their way up the familiar mountain trail. Frank carried a lantern shuttered to allow only the thinnest beam of light, while Jed shouldered a canvas sack containing the tools they'd gathered from the store. The night air was crisp with the promise of an early frost, and their breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin mountain atmosphere. Boone led the way with the confidence of an animal returning to territory he knew by heart, but his movements held an urgency that spoke of purpose beyond simple homecoming. Every few yards, the dog would pause and lift his nose to test the air, not for threats, but for something else entirely, a scent trail that seemed to grow stronger as they approached the ruins. "Easy, boy," Jed whispered as they crested the final rise. Below them lay the blackened skeleton of what had once been his home, the stone foundation and chimney standing like tombstones in a graveyard of ash and charred timber. Frank whistled low under his breath. They did a thorough job of it. Nothing left but the bones. But Jed was watching Boone, whose entire body had gone rigid with anticipation. The dog's tail quivered, and a soft whine escaped his throat, not distress but excitement barely held in check. It was the same behavior Jed had observed when Boone had treed a particularly elusive raccoon, or located a deer that had been wounded and gone to ground. "He's found something," Jed said, more to himself than to Frank. They approached the ruins carefully, mindful that Webb's men might have left sentries to watch for Jed's return. But the mountainside was quiet, except for the usual night sounds, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the pines. The hearth and chimney had indeed survived the fire, just as Jed had hoped. The stones were blackened with soot, but intact, and the heavy iron grate that had held so many warming fires lay twisted but unbroken among the debris. It was here that Boone focused his attention, circling the area with the methodical precision of a professional tracker. "What do you think he's after?" Frank asked, keeping his voice low. "I'm beginning to have an idea," Jed replied, pulling the photograph from his pocket and studying the faint pencil marks on the back. "Frank, can you bring that light over here?" In the lantern's narrow beam, the crude map became more visible. The converging lines definitely pointed to a spot marked HS, Hearthstone. But it wasn't the hearth itself that was marked. It was a position slightly to the northeast, where the foundation stones met the natural bedrock of the mountain. Boone had stopped his circling and now stood perfectly still, staring at a specific point among the foundation stones. His whole body trembled with the effort of remaining motionless, every instinct telling him to dig, but waiting for permission from his human partner. "There," Jed said, pointing to where Boone stood. "That's where we need to look." Frank played the lantern beam across the area. What had appeared to be simply another section of foundation revealed itself, under closer examination, to be slightly different from the surrounding stonework. The mortar was a different color, suggesting it had been disturbed and reset sometime after the original construction. "Your father did some work here after he built the cabin," Frank observed. "This section's been rebuilt, maybe more than once." Jed knelt beside Boone and ran his hands over the stones. They were warm from retaining heat from the fire, but beneath that surface warmth, he could feel something else, a slight hollow sound when he tapped certain blocks, as if there were empty space beneath them. "We're going to need to move some of these stones," he said, opening the tool sack and withdrawing a crowbar and hammer. Working by the dim light of Frank's shielded lantern, they began the careful process of dismantling the section of foundation that had drawn Boone's attention. The dog supervised every move, occasionally nudging Jed's elbow when he seemed to be working in the wrong direction, guiding the excavation with the precision of an animal who knew exactly what they were looking for. The first stone came away easily, revealing that the mortar beneath was indeed newer than the surrounding foundation. The second stone required more effort, but as it shifted, both men could hear the distinct sound of metal striking stone from somewhere below. "There's something down there," Frank said, his voice tight with excitement. Jed's hands were trembling slightly as he worked the crowbar under the third stone. This was the moment that would determine whether his father's dying words had been the ramblings of a fevered mind or the key to a mystery that had waited 40 years for resolution. The stone shifted, then lifted away completely. In the space beneath, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected it from decades of mountain weather, lay a small wooden box. The container was roughly made but solid, crafted from the same mountain pine that had built the cabin above it. Boone's tail began to wag, not the frantic excitement of a dog who'd found a buried bone, but the deep satisfaction of an animal who'd successfully completed a complex task. He sat back on his haunches and watched as Jed carefully lifted the box from its hiding place. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank breathed. "Your father really did bury something here." The box was heavier than its size suggested, and something rattled inside when Jed moved it. His hands shook as he worked at the simple wooden latch that held it closed. The mechanism was stiff with age, but it finally gave way with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the mountain silence. Inside the box, nestled in what had once been fine cloth but was now faded and brittle with age, lay an object that made both men catch their breath. It was a compass, but not the simple directional instrument that most travelers carried. This was a precision instrument made of gleaming brass and silver, with intricate engravings around its face and a weight that spoke of exceptional craftsmanship. But it wasn't just a compass. It was a surveyor's compass, the kind used for mapping mining claims and establishing legal boundaries. On the back, engraved in elegant script, were the words, "Property of Jed Carter, Silver Creek Mining Partnership, 1847. Beneath the compass, wrapped in another piece of oiled cloth, were papers, legal documents, their edges brown with age, but their text still clearly readable. Mining claims, partnership agreements, and most significantly a survey map that showed the exact location and extent of the Silver Creek mine. "This is it," Jed whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is what my father was trying to tell me." Frank held the lantern closer as Jed spread the papers carefully on a flat stone. The survey map was remarkably detailed, showing not just the mine entrance, but a network of tunnels that extended deep into the mountain. Notations in the margins indicated ore quality and estimated reserves, figures that made both men's eyes widen. "According to this," Frank said, running his finger along the survey lines, "the Silver Creek mine extends right under where your cabin stood. This whole area is part of the original claim, but it was the partnership agreement that held the most startling revelation. The document clearly stated that Jacob Carter and Malcolm Webb, Marcus Webb's father, had entered into a 50-50 partnership for the development and exploitation of the Silver Creek mine. Both men's signatures were clearly visible at the bottom of the agreement, along with the official seal of the Territorial Mining Office. 50-50, Jed repeated, looking up at Frank, not the 40% the photograph mentioned. Equal partners. There was more. A second document, dated 6 months later, showed that Malcolm Webb had attempted to buy out Jacob Carter's share for a fraction of its value. Carter had refused, and according to the notations in the margin, written in his father's careful hand, Webb had responded by having Carter accused of claim jumping and run out of the territory. "He was cheated," Frank said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Your father was cheated out of his rightful share. And now his son is sitting on top of a silver mine that could be worth," he paused, doing calculations in his head based on the ore samples described in the survey. "Could be worth what?" Jed asked. Frank whistled low. "Based on current silver prices and these ore estimates, maybe $5 million, maybe more." The figure hung in the air between them like a physical presence. $5 million, more money than either man could properly comprehend. Hidden beneath the foundation stones of a mountain cabin for more than 40 years. Boone had moved closer during their examination of the documents, and now he placed his head on Jed's knee in a gesture of quiet companionship. The dog seemed to understand that something momentous had been accomplished, that the scent trail he'd been following had finally led to its destination. "This changes everything," Jed said, carefully folding the papers and returning them to the box along with the compass. "Webb didn't just burn my cabin for spite. He knew about this. Somehow he found out about the mine. Question is," Frank replied, "what do you plan to do about it?" Before Jed could answer, Boone's head came up sharply. His ears pricked toward the trail they'd used to approach the ruins. The dog's posture shifted from relaxed companionship to alert wariness, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "Someone's coming," Frank whispered, quickly shuttering the lantern. In the sudden darkness, They could hear what Boone's keener senses had detected first, the soft sounds of horses moving carefully up the mountain trail, their riders trying to approach without being detected. Jed clutched the wooden box to his chest, understanding with crystal clarity that the secret it contained was worth killing for. Webb's men had returned, and this time they weren't coming to burn an empty cabin. They were coming to silence the only man who could prove that the Silver Creek mine rightfully belonged to the Carter family. The compass in the box seemed to grow heavier in his hands, as if the weight of justice delayed was pressing down through the brass and silver. His father's legacy was finally within reach, but keeping it alive long enough to see justice done was going to require all the mountain wisdom Jed had accumulated in his 63 years, and it was going to require the loyalty and keen senses of a dog who had just proven that some treasures are worth waiting 40 years to uncover. The Cedar Falls courthouse sat like a fortress of red brick and frontier ambition at the center of the town's main square. Its records room smelled of dust, old paper, and the persistent tang of ink that had been absorbing into wooden shelves for more than 30 years. Jed sat at a scarred oak table, the precious wooden box open beside him, while Sarah Murphy helped him navigate through decades of mining claims and land transfers. They had escaped Webb's men 3 nights ago by following game trails that only a lifetime mountain dweller would know. But the close call had convinced Jed that he needed more than just the documents from his father's cache. He needed legal ammunition that would stand up in court, and that meant understanding the full scope of how the Webb family had built their empire on stolen claims. "Here's something," Sarah said, pulling a leather-bound ledger from a high shelf. "Mining partnerships registered in 1847. She opened the book carefully, its spine cracking with age, and ran her finger down columns of faded entries. Jed held his breath as she reached the entries for Silver Creek. There, in the careful handwriting of some long-dead clerk, was the original partnership agreement between Jacob Carter and Malcolm Webb, senior 50-50 partners, just as the documents in the box had claimed. But Sarah's expression grew troubled as she continued reading. "There are additional entries here, Jed. Look at this." She pointed to a series of amendments dated 6 months after the original partnership. According to the courthouse records, Jacob Carter had signed over his entire share to Malcolm Webb for the sum of $100, a fraction of what even a played-out mine would have been worth. "That's not right," Jed said, comparing the signature to his father's handwriting on other documents. "This isn't his signature. Look at the way the J is formed. My father always made it with a distinctive flourish. See here, in his real signature on the partnership agreement. This other one is crude, like someone was copying it without." Understanding the natural flow of his hand, Sarah studied both signatures with the careful attention of a woman who had reviewed countless receipts and invoices in her husband's store. "You're right. This is forgery, and not a particularly skillful one. But it's been in the official record for 40 years. That gives it legal weight, regardless of how it got there." The implications were staggering. Not only had Malcolm Webb stolen Jacob Carter's share of the Silver Creek mine, but he'd done it through fraud and forgery, then used the courthouse records to legitimize his theft. And if the pattern held, other mining claims in the area might have been acquired through similar means. "We need to look at other records from that same period," Jed said. "See if there are more forged transfers, more partnerships that mysteriously became Webb property." They spent the next 2 hours pulling dusty ledgers and examining mining claims from the late 1840s and early 1850s. What they found painted a picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond the Silver Creek mine. At least 6 other mining partnerships showed the same pattern. Legitimate partnerships established with local prospectors, followed months later by suspicious transfers that signed away the other partners' shares for nominal amounts. But it was the final document Sarah discovered that provided the missing piece of the puzzle, hidden in a folder marked Territorial Marshal Reports. She found a faded carbon Copy of an official complaint filed by Jacob Carter in 1848. The report detailed his allegations of fraud against Malcolm Webb and included witness statements from other miners who claimed they had been similarly cheated. The investigating marshal's name was stamped at the bottom of the report. Deputy U.S. Marshal James Carter, Jacob's older brother and Jed's uncle. A man Jed had heard mentioned only in whispers during his childhood. Your uncle was a federal marshal, Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement, and he was investigating Malcolm Webb for mining fraud. But look at this. She turned the page to reveal the final entry in the file, a terse notation that the investigation had been terminated due to the complainant's departure from the territory and insufficient evidence to pursue federal charges. They ran him out, Jed said, understanding flooding through him. Webb and his allies found a way to discredit my father and force him to leave before he could testify. And without his testimony, Uncle James couldn't make the fraud charges stick. The pieces of his family's history were finally falling into place. His father's restless wandering during Jed's childhood, the way Jacob Carter had always seemed to be looking over his shoulder, the reluctance to talk about the early days in Colorado. It all made sense now. Jacob Carter hadn't been a failed prospector chasing impossible dreams. He'd been a victim of fraud who'd been forced into exile to protect his family. Sarah carefully photographed each relevant document using a small camera she'd borrowed from Doc Henley. The images would serve as backup evidence, but Jed knew that the original documents in his father's wooden box would be the key to any legal action. The problem was that Marcus Webb, unlike his father, had the resources to fight a prolonged court battle and the connections to make witnesses disappear. There's something else we need to consider, Sarah said as they prepared to leave the courthouse. If Webb is willing to burn down your cabin and send armed men after you, what's he going to do when he realizes you have evidence that could destroy his family's entire fortune? It was a sobering question. The documents proved that the Webb empire had been built on systematic fraud, but they also made Jed a target for anyone willing to kill to protect a $5 million secret. And Marcus Webb had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. As they walked back toward the Murphy store, Jed noticed unusual activity in the town. Groups of men stood talking in low voices on street corners, and more than once he caught someone staring at him with uncomfortable intensity. Word was spreading that something significant was happening, though the exact nature of the discovery was still known only to a few trusted allies. Frank Murphy met them at the store's back entrance, his face grave. "We need to talk," he said, ushering them inside quickly. "Webb's been asking questions around town. He's offering money for information about your whereabouts, and he's brought in more men. Odd-looking types who don't seem interested in ranch work." Inside the store's back room, away from prying eyes and listening ears, they spread out the documents and photographs on Frank's desk. The mining deed, the official document that established the original Silver Creek partnership, lay in the center like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. "This deed changes everything," Frank said, studying the legal language carefully. "If these documents are authentic, and if we can prove the forgery in the courthouse records, then you're the rightful owner of not just the Silver Creek mine, but probably half a dozen other claims that Webb has been working for the past 40 years. The question is how to make it stick in court," Jed replied. "Webb has money, influence, and no scruples about using violence to protect his interests. Even if we can prove fraud, can we live long enough to see justice done?" Sarah had been examining the mining deed with a magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the official seals and signatures. "There's something here you both need to see," she said, her voice tense with excitement. She pointed to a small notation in the margin of the deed, barely visible unless one knew where to look. In faded ink, someone had written a series of numbers, followed by the initials J.C. Jacob Carter. "Those numbers," Frank said, leaning closer. "They look like coordinates. Longitude and latitude markings." Jed felt his pulse quicken. His father had been a careful man, someone who believed in documenting important information in multiple ways. If Jacob Carter had hidden legal documents under the cabin's hearth, where else might he have cached evidence of Webb's fraudulent activities? "We need to check these coordinates," Jed said. "If my father was as thorough as I'm beginning to think he was, there might be more evidence hidden somewhere else on the mountain." But even as he spoke, Jed realized they were facing a race against time. Webb's increasing desperation and the arrival of additional hired guns suggested that the wealthy rancher was preparing for a final, violent solution to the problem Jed represented. The evidence might prove Jacob Carter's rightful claim to the Silver Creek mine, but only if his son lived long enough to present it in court. Boone, who had been lying quietly in the corner of the room, suddenly raised his head and looked toward the store's front entrance. The dog's ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, not the excited anticipation he'd shown at the cabin ruins, but the warning signal of an animal sensing immediate danger. "Someone's coming," Frank said, recognizing the dog's alert posture. Through the store's front window, they could see 3 riders approaching down the main street. Even at a distance, there was something menacing about the way they sat their horses, the careful way they surveyed the buildings as they passed. These weren't casual visitors to Cedar Falls. They were hunters, and Jed had little doubt about what they were. Hunting. The mining deed seemed to grow heavier in his hands as he realized that, proving his father's innocence and his own rightful claim to a fortune might require surviving long enough to get the evidence before a judge. And with Marcus Webb's resources and ruthlessness, survival was becoming an increasingly complicated proposition. But the compass in the wooden box seemed to pulse with its own weight of justice delayed. And Jed found himself thinking about his Uncle James, the federal marshal who had tried to investigate Webb's crimes 40 years ago. Some fights, he realized, were worth having regardless of the odds, especially when they involved setting right wrongs that had festered for nearly half a century. The question now was whether an old mountain man, a loyal dog, and a handful of decent townspeople could stand against the kind of money and violence that had built an empire on stolen claims and forged documents. The coordinates led them to a narrow canyon 3 miles west of Jed's burned cabin, a place where autumn aspens created a cathedral of gold against the granite walls. Sarah insisted on coming despite Frank's protests, arguing that her smaller hands might be better suited to retrieving whatever Jacob Carter had, hidden in the rocky crevices that honeycombed the canyon walls. Boone had grown increasingly restless over the past 2 days, his protective instincts heightened by the presence of Webb's men who had taken up positions around town. The dog's usual calm demeanor had given way to constant vigilance, his head turning at every sound, his nose testing the air for threats that human senses couldn't detect. "There," Jed said, pointing to a distinctive rock formation that matched the crude sketch his father had drawn on the back of the mining deed. "That outcropping about 20 feet up, see how it forms a natural shelf?" Frank studied the cliff face with the practiced eye of a man who had done his share of difficult climbs in his younger days. "It's reachable, but barely. Your father must have been part mountain goat to get up there with whatever he was hiding." The ascent was treacherous, made more difficult by the loose scree that shifted underfoot with every step. But Jacob Carter had chosen his hiding place well. It was virtually invisible from below, and would require deliberate searching by someone who knew exactly where to look. Sarah reached the shelf first, her lighter weight making her less likely to dislodge the unstable rock. What she found there, wedged deep in a crevice and wrapped in oiled canvas, was a leather satchel that had survived 40 years of mountain weather with remarkable preservation. Inside the satchel was Jacob Carter's hidden journal, written in the same careful hand that had filled the margins of his Bible with observations about justice and faith. But this journal contained more than philosophical musings. It was a detailed record of Malcolm Webb's criminal activities, complete with dates, names, and methods. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading from an entry dated September 1847. Malcolm Webb approached 3 more miners today with offers to buy their claims at below-market prices. When they refused, he mentioned that accidents have a way of happening to stubborn men who don't know when to take good advice. Tom Henderson's barn fire last week wasn't as accidental as folks believe. The Journal painted a picture of systematic intimidation and fraud that extended far beyond mining claims. Webb Sr. had used a combination of legal manipulation, violence, and political corruption to build what would become the foundation of his family's wealth. Jacob Carter had documented it all with the methodical precision of a man who understood that someday someone would need proof of the crimes he'd witnessed, but it was the final entries that sent a chill through all 3 readers. In increasingly urgent handwriting, Jacob Carter described threats against his family, mysterious accidents that befell anyone who opposed Webb's expansion, and his growing realization that his own life was in danger. October 15th, 1848, Sarah read aloud. Webb's men came to the cabin today while Jed was in town with his mother. They didn't threaten directly, but the message was clear. Leave the territory or face the consequences. I've hidden the evidence where my son will find it if something happens to me. The compass and documents are under the hearthstone, but this journal contains the full truth. Someday, justice will have its day. The journal's final entry was dated just 3 days before Jacob Carter packed up his family and left Colorado forever. In it, he expressed hope that his son would someday return to claim what was rightfully theirs, but also fear that the Webb family's power would only grow with time. Frank whistled low as he examined a detailed map that Jacob had drawn, showing the extent of Webb's fraudulent land acquisitions. According to this, Webb Sr. stole claims worth millions in today's money. No wonder Marcus is willing to kill to keep it quiet. But the journal contained one more surprise, a letter addressed to Deputy U.S. Marshal James Carter. Never sent but preserved in the hopes that it might someday reach its intended recipient. The letter detailed specific instances of federal crimes, including the bribery of territorial officials and the intimidation of witnesses in federal mining disputes. Your uncle might still be alive, Sarah said thoughtfully. Federal marshals often lived well into their 70s, and if he was your father's older brother, he could still be serving somewhere in the territory. The possibility sent a jolt of hope through Jed. A federal marshal would have the authority to investigate Webb's crimes properly, and the weight of federal law behind any prosecution. But it also meant that time was running out. If Webb realized that evidence existed that could bring federal charges, he would escalate his violent response accordingly. As they prepared to descend from the canyon, Boone's alert posture caught Jed's attention. The dog was staring intently down the narrow canyon floor, his hackles raised and a low growl vibrating in his chest. Following the dog's gaze, Jed could see dust rising from the canyon entrance, riders approaching at speed. "We need to get out of here," Frank said urgently. But even as he spoke, they could hear the echo of hoofbeats bouncing off the canyon walls. There were too many riders to fight, and the narrow canyon offered limited options for escape. "Up," Jed said, pointing to a game trail that switchbacked up the canyon's eastern wall. "It's our only chance." They climbed with desperate urgency, the loose rock betraying their position, with small avalanches that clattered down into the canyon below. Behind them, they could hear Webb's men shouting as they discovered the evidence of recent activity around the hidden cache. Sarah stumbled on the steep trail, and for a terrifying moment it seemed she might fall back into the canyon. But Jed caught her arm, steadying her as they continued their frantic ascent. The leather satchel containing his father's journal was clutched tightly to her chest, its contents potentially worth more than their combined lives. They reached the canyon rim just as the first shots rang out from below. Webb's men had spotted them on the trail and were firing upward, though the extreme angle and distance made accuracy nearly impossible. Still, the bullets chipping rock nearby served as a stark reminder of how far Webb was willing to go to protect his secrets. From the rim, they could see the full scope of their predicament. 8 riders had followed them into the canyon, and there were undoubtedly more positioned to cut off other escape routes. Webb wasn't just trying to silence them, he was mounting a military-style operation to eliminate every trace of evidence that could challenge his family's claim to their stolen empire. "There's something else," Sarah said, still catching her breath from the climb. "I found this tucked into the back of the journal." She pulled out a small piece of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times it was nearly falling apart. When she opened it carefully, it revealed a list of names: federal judges, marshals, and territorial officials who Jacob Carter believed could be trusted to act on evidence of Webb's crimes. At the top of the list, underlined twice, was the name Judge Samuel Morrison, Federal District Court, Denver. Below it, in Jacob's careful handwriting, was the notation, "Incorruptible. Lost his own brother to claim jumpers. Will act if evidence is presented properly." "Denver's 3 days' ride from here," Frank said, studying the terrain spread out below them. "But Webb's got men watching all the main roads. Getting there alive with this evidence is going to be a challenge." Jed looked down at Boone, who was still monitoring the canyon below with the vigilant attention of a sentry. The dog had led them to both caches of evidence, had warned them of approaching danger, and had shown loyalty that went far beyond what any man had a right to expect from any creature. "We'll make it," Jed said, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of a man who had made peace with difficult odds. "My father waited 40 years for justice, and his evidence has waited that long too. A few more days won't matter, as long as we're smart about how we travel." But even as he spoke, Jed realized that their discovery of Jacob Carter's hidden journal had fundamentally changed the stakes. What had begun as a dispute over mining claims had evolved into something much larger, a federal case involving systematic fraud, political corruption, and decades of violence used to maintain an illegitimate empire. The compass in the wooden box had pointed them toward the truth. But now they needed more than navigation. They needed the kind of courage that would carry them through 3 days of hostile territory, with evidence that could topple one of the territory's most powerful families. Webb's men were already beginning their own ascent of the canyon walls, and Jed knew that this was only the beginning. The real test would come in the hours and days ahead, when every mile toward Denver would be contested by men who understood that their own lives depended on ensuring that Jacob Carter's journal never reached federal authorities. As they moved away from the canyon rim, following game trails that would keep them hidden from the main roads, Jed felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him like a physical burden. Justice delayed for 40 years was finally within reach, but only if an old mountain man, his loyal dog, and 2 brave townspeople could survive long enough to place it in the right hands. The confrontation came at dawn on their second day of travel, when Webb himself rode into their hidden camp with a dozen armed men. Jed had chosen their resting place carefully, a sheltered grove beside a mountain stream where the sound of running water would mask their voices and the thick pines would hide their fire. But somehow, Webb had found them anyway. "Mr. Carter!" Webb called out, his voice carrying the false courtesy that barely concealed his desperation. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Jed emerged from the grove with his rifle ready, Frank and Sarah flanking him with their own weapons drawn. Boone stayed close to his master's side, every muscle tense and ready for action. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and their breath formed small clouds as they faced the circle of mounted men. "Seems to me we had our conversation 3 nights ago," Jed replied. "When you burned down my home." Webb dismounted with the careful movements of a man who wasn't accustomed to physical confrontation, but had been forced into one by circumstances beyond his control. Up close, in the clear mountain light, he looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of maintaining an empire built on lies. "That was unfortunate," Webb said, spreading his hands in a gesture meant to suggest reasonableness. "Emotions were running high, and my men sometimes act with more enthusiasm than judgment. I've come to make amends, with 12 guns backing your apology." Frank asked, his own rifle never wavering from Webb's chest. Webb's smile was thin and unconvincing. Insurance, Mr. Murphy. A man in my position has to be careful, especially when dealing with people who might not have his best interests at heart. Sarah stepped forward, the leather satchel containing Jacob's journal clutched protectively against her chest. We know what your family did, Mr. Webb. We have proof of the fraud, the forgeries, the intimidation. 40 years of crimes documented in your victim's own words. For just a moment, Webb's mask slipped, and they could see the fear beneath his confident facade. But then his expression hardened, and he reached into his coat with a deliberate slowness that suggested he was retrieving something important. What he withdrew was a leather folder, aged and worn but obviously well-preserved. He opened it carefully and held up a document that made both Jed and Sarah gasp in recognition. It was another copy of Jacob Carter's partnership agreement with Malcolm Webb, but this one bore additional signatures and seals. Federal Marshal authorization, Webb said, his voice regaining its confidence. Signed by Deputy U.S. Marshal James Carter himself, authorizing the investigation of mining fraud in this territory. Your uncle was a thorough man, Mr. Carter, very thorough indeed. The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. His Uncle James hadn't just investigated Webb's crimes. He had documented them officially, created a federal case that should have resulted in prosecution and justice. But somehow that case had been buried, and James Carter had disappeared from the historical record. Where did you get that? Jed demanded, his voice tight with a combination of hope and dread. Webb's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. From Marshal Carter himself, the night he died. Oh yes, Mr. Carter, I was there. I was just a young man then, helping my father clean up the loose ends of his business empire. Your uncle was a stubborn man, much like yourself. He refused several generous offers to forget what he'd discovered. The revelation struck like a thunderbolt. James Carter hadn't simply given up his investigation. He'd been murdered for it. And Malcolm Webb's son had been present, had participated in covering up a federal marshal's death. You killed him, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father killed him, Webb corrected with chilling precision. I merely helped dispose of the evidence. But Marshal Carter was a careful man, just like your father. Mr. Carter. He kept copies of everything, and he hid them where he thought they'd be safe. Webb reached into the folder again and withdrew something that made Boone growl with sudden intensity. It was a badge, a federal marshal's star, tarnished with age but unmistakably authentic. And pinned to the badge was a small silver compass, identical to the one they'd found under Jed's hearth. He was carrying this when he died, Webb continued, apparently enjoying the shock on their faces. Apparently, it was some sort of family heirloom. Your father gave it to him when he left Colorado, along with instructions about where to find additional evidence if something happened to your family. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Jacob Carter hadn't just hidden evidence of Webb's crimes. He'd coordinated with his brother to build a federal case. James Carter hadn't given up his investigation. He'd been murdered before he could complete it. And the Webb family had spent 40 years believing they had successfully buried both the evidence and the witnesses. But here's what my father never understood, Webb said, his voice taking on the tone of a man revealing his greatest triumph. Marshal Carter had already filed preliminary reports with his superiors in Denver. Copies exist in federal archives, waiting for someone with the authority and the evidence to reopen the case. Frank's rifle was still trained on Webb, but his voice carried a note of confusion. If federal evidence exists, why are you telling us this? Why not just let sleeping dogs lie? Webb's laugh was genuinely amused, as if Frank had asked a particularly naive question. Because, Mr. Murphy, those preliminary reports implicate my father, not me. I was a minor when most of these crimes occurred, legally protected by my age and my family's influence. But if new evidence surfaces, evidence that proves I participated in covering up a federal marshal's murder, then suddenly I become liable for federal charges that carry the death penalty. The cold calculation in Webb's voice made clear that this wasn't a desperate man making threats. This was a careful strategist who had thought through every angle of his situation. He needed Jed dead, not just to protect his family's stolen wealth, but to protect his own life. So you see, Webb continued, this isn't really about mining claims anymore. It's about survival, and I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to ensure that survival. The question is whether you're prepared to be reasonable about this situation. Jed felt the weight of his uncle's badge in Webb's hands, the symbol of federal authority that should have brought justice 4 decades ago. But he also felt the weight of the evidence in the satchel Sarah carried, and the promise he'd made to his father's memory. "What are you proposing?" he asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. "Simple," Webb replied. "You give me the journal and any other evidence you've found. In return, I'll provide you with enough money to start a new life somewhere far from Colorado. Everyone goes home happy, and old secrets stay buried where they belong. And if we refuse—" Webb's expression went flat and emotionless. "Then you die here along with your friends. My men will swear you attacked us first, and the territorial sheriff will rule it's self-defense. Your bodies will be found weeks from now, if they're found at all, and any evidence you might have carried will have mysteriously disappeared." Sarah clutched the satchel tighter, and Jed could see the fear in her eyes. But he could also see something else: determination. She understood, as he did, that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. "There's one thing you haven't considered," Jed said quietly. "And what's that?" Jed looked down at Boone, who was watching Webb with the intense focus of a predator preparing to strike. The dog had been unusually alert since Webb's arrival. Not just defensive, but actively hostile in a way that suggested he sensed something beyond normal human perception. "That badge you're carrying," Jed said. "It still carries my uncle's scent, doesn't it? 40 years might seem like a long time to you, but to a bloodhound's nose, it might as well be yesterday." Webb's confidence faltered slightly as he looked down at the badge in his hands, then at the dog, whose hackles were now fully raised. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you just provided evidence of your own guilt," Jed replied. "That badge connects you directly to my uncle's murder, and every man here has just heard you confess to helping cover it up." The morning stillness was broken by the sound of approaching horses, more riders coming up the mountain trail. But these weren't Webb's men. The lead rider wore the unmistakable uniform of a territorial marshal, and behind him rode a dozen federal agents. Webb spun around, his face going pale as he realized that his carefully planned confrontation had become a trap. "How?" "Because," said a voice from behind the approaching lawman, "some of us have been waiting 40 years for this moment." An elderly man in a federal marshal's uniform rode forward, his weathered face bearing an unmistakable resemblance to both Jacob and Jed Carter. Despite his age, Deputy U.S. Marshal James Carter sat his horse with the authority of a man who had spent a lifetime serving federal justice. "Hello, nephew," he said quietly. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The reunion between uncle and nephew took place in the shadow of federal justice, with Webb's men surrounded and disarmed by Marshal Carter's agents. But there was no time for extended family reminiscences. James Carter had spent 40 years building a case that would finally bring the Webb empire to its knees, and he needed Jed's evidence to complete it. "I never died," the old marshal explained, as they examined the documents spread across a makeshift table. "But I let everyone believe I had. It was the only way to stay alive long enough to gather the evidence needed to make federal charges stick." In his weathered hands, he held a telegraph key, brass and worn smooth from decades of use. This was the instrument he'd used to coordinate with federal authorities across the territory, building a network of evidence and witnesses that Webb's money and influence couldn't reach. Every telegraph message, every witness statement, every piece of evidence I couldn't present 40 years ago, it's all been preserved in federal archives, waiting for the right moment to surface. Your father's journal and the partnership documents provide the final pieces we needed. Sarah watched the old marshal work with practiced efficiency, organizing documents and preparing witness statements. with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades planning for this moment. "How did you know we'd be here?" she asked. James Carter's smile was grim but satisfied. "Because I've been watching the Webb family for 40 years. Every suspicious death, every convenient fire, every forced sale of property, I've documented all of it. When Marcus started bringing in hired guns and asking questions about mining claims, I knew Jacob's boy had finally come home to claim his inheritance. The implications were staggering. For 4 decades, while Jed had lived quietly on his mountain, his uncle had been building a federal case that would expose not just the original mining fraud, but a pattern of criminal behavior that extended across generations. The Webb Empire hadn't just been built on stolen silver, it had been maintained through systematic murder, intimidation, and corruption. Frank studied the telegraph key with the fascination of a man seeing history made tangible. All those years, you were communicating with federal authorities. Denver, Washington, even judges in California who'd been tracking similar patterns of mining fraud, James replied. The Webb family's crimes weren't limited to Colorado. Malcolm Webb and his associates had a network that stretched across the Western Territories, always staying one step ahead of local law enforcement. But it was Boone's behavior that concerned Jed most. The dog had grown increasingly agitated since Webb's capture, pacing restlessly and periodically lifting his nose to test the air. The same instincts that had led them to the hidden evidence were now warning of danger that human senses couldn't detect. "Uncle James," Jed said carefully, "how many men does Webb have working for him?" "We've seen maybe 20, but closer to 50, the marshal replied grimly. "Ranch hands who are actually hired guns, business associates who are really enforcers, and at least a dozen professional killers brought in from other territories. Taking Webb into custody was just the first step. His organization is still intact, and they have orders to eliminate any witnesses who might testify against him." As if to emphasize the point, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the mountainside. Webb's remaining men were making their move, trying to rescue their boss or eliminate the evidence that could destroy them all. The federal agents who had accompanied Marshal Carter were skilled and well-armed, but they were also outnumbered and fighting on terrain that favored the defenders. "We need to get this evidence to Denver," James said, gathering the most crucial documents into a waterproof pouch. "Judge Morrison has been waiting for these documents for 40 years. With them, he can issue federal warrants that will shut down Webb's entire operation. But getting to Denver meant traveling through territory controlled by men who had nothing left to lose. Webb's organization was facing complete destruction, and desperate men were capable of extreme measures. The 3-day journey that had seemed challenging with a handful of pursuers now looked nearly impossible, with an army of killers blocking every route. "There's another way," Sarah said quietly. She had been studying the topographical maps that Marshal Carter carried, comparing them to the crude sketches in Jacob's journal. "Your father marked a trail through the high country, difficult and dangerous, but it would bypass the main roads completely." Jed examined the route Sarah indicated. It was indeed treacherous, following game trails and natural passages that would challenge even experienced mountain travelers. But it was also the kind of route that Webb's hired guns, most of them more comfortable in saloons than on mountain peaks, would be unlikely to follow. "It's our best chance," he agreed. "But we'll be traveling in weather that could turn deadly without warning, and carrying evidence that men are willing to kill for." James Carter nodded, understanding the stakes better than anyone. "I've waited 40 years for justice. A few more days of risk won't change anything as long as these documents reach Judge Morrison." The preparations took on the urgency of men preparing for battle. Essential supplies were redistributed to account for the challenging route. Weapons were checked and cleaned, and emergency plans were made for various contingencies. Through it all, Webb watched from his position under guard, his face a mask of cold fury. "You think this ends with my arrest?" he called out as they prepared to leave. "My family has been building this empire for 2 generations. There are judges, sheriffs, and territorial officials who owe their positions to Webb money. Even if Morrison issues warrants, executing them will be another matter entirely. His words carried the ring of truth that made everyone uncomfortable. Corruption was a poison that spread through many levels of territorial government, and Webb's influence extended far beyond what they could see or prove. Taking down his criminal organization would require more than federal warrants. It would need the kind of evidence that could expose the entire network of complicity. But Boone's continued. Agitation finally crystallized into action. The dog moved to the edge of their camp and began a low, sustained howl that raised the hair on everyone's neck. It wasn't the baying of a hound on a scent trail. It was the warning cry of an animal that sensed approaching death. "They're coming," Marshal Carter said, recognizing the signs of an organized assault. "More men than we expected, and they're not interested in taking prisoners." Through the trees, they could see muzzle flashes and hear the organized shouts of men executing a coordinated attack. Webb's remaining forces were making their final desperate play, willing to risk everything in an attempt to rescue their leader and eliminate the witnesses who could destroy them. "Move!" James shouted, but even as the words left his mouth, everyone understood that their carefully planned escape had been anticipated. Webb's men had positioned themselves to cut off the mountain routes, forcing a confrontation on ground of their choosing. The telegraph key felt heavier in Marshal Carter's hands as he realized that 40 years of patient investigation might die with them in these mountains. But the evidence in the waterproof pouch represented more than just legal documents. It was the accumulated weight of every victim who had suffered at Webb hands, every family that had been cheated out of their rightful inheritance, every honest man who had been killed for standing in the way of corruption. "There's one more option," Jed said, his voice carrying the quiet determination of a man who had made peace with difficult choices. "We make our stand here. Fight them with everything we have, and make sure at least one of us gets through with the evidence." Sarah clutched the leather satchel containing Jacob's journal, understanding that she was holding 40 years of suppressed truth in her hands. "How many of them are there?" The sound of approaching horses and shouted commands provided the answer. Too many to fight directly, but perhaps not too many to outwit, if they were smart about how they used the terrain and the advantages that home ground provided. Boone had stopped howling and now stood beside Jed with the alert posture of a warrior preparing for battle. The dog's loyalty had already led them to hidden treasure and preserved evidence. Now it would be tested in the crucible of violent men who understood only force and feared nothing but the exposure of their crimes. As the first shots rang out from the surrounding forest, Jed felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him like a physical presence. Justice delayed for 40 years was finally within reach, but claiming it would require surviving the next few hours against odds that would have intimidated a younger, more optimistic man. The telegraph key seemed to pulse with its own rhythm of Morse code, as if the accumulated messages of 4 decades were demanding to be heard at last. The first assault came from the east, where Webb's men had positioned themselves to take advantage of the morning sun at their backs. Jed crouched behind a fallen pine log, his father's service revolver steady in his weathered hands. The weapon was a Colt Army model that Jacob Carter had carried during his brief stint as a territorial deputy, and it felt heavy with the weight of family legacy and delayed justice. Boone lay flat beside him, every muscle coiled for action. The dog's breathing was controlled and deliberate, the behavior of an animal that understood the gravity of the situation and was prepared to fight to the death for his human family. In the growing light, his blue-gray coat blended perfectly with the granite outcroppings that provided their defensive position. 12 men coming up the slope, Frank whispered from his position 20 yards to the south. His own rifle, a Winchester that had seen action in more than one frontier conflict, tracked the advancing figures with practiced precision. Sarah had taken shelter behind a massive boulder with Uncle James and the precious evidence that had cost so many lives to preserve. The elderly marshal's own weapon was drawn, but his primary focus was on the waterproof pouch that contained 40 years of accumulated proof. If they died here, he was determined that the evidence would survive to reach Judge Morrison in Denver. The attack began with a volley of rifle fire that splintered bark and chipped stone all around their position. Webb's men were advancing in a coordinated fashion, using natural cover and suppressing fire to close the distance between them and their targets. These weren't the usual hired guns that frontier towns attracted. They were professional killers with military experience. "They're flanking us on the north side," James called out, his keen eyes spotting movement through the trees. "At least 6 more men, maybe 8. Jed's first shot took down the lead attacker, a tall man in a black coat who had been directing the others' movements. The .45 caliber bullet struck with the finality that only came from a lifetime of hunting game where a missed shot meant going hungry. But even as the man fell, his companions pressed forward, with the determination of soldiers who understood that retreat meant certain death for their. The cause at Boone erupted into motion when 2 attackers broke from cover and charged directly toward their position. The dog moved with the fluid grace of a predator in his element, using the rocky terrain to his advantage as he intercepted the first man before he could bring his rifle to bear. The sound of the man's scream echoed across the mountainside, followed by the wet crack of bones breaking under powerful jaws. Frank's Winchester spoke 3 times in rapid succession, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. 2 more of Webb's men went down, but the survivors were already adapting their tactics, using the confusion of the dog's attack to advance under cover of their fallen comrades' positions. "Sarah!" Jed shouted as he saw movement behind the boulder where she and his uncle had taken shelter. A group of attackers had worked their way around through the thick pines and were preparing to assault their position from behind. The young woman proved she was made of sterner stuff than anyone had imagined. Her small revolver barked twice, and one of the flanking attackers stumbled and fell. But there were still too many, and they were too close for comfort. Uncle James rose from behind the boulder with the fluid motion of a man who had spent a lifetime in dangerous situations. His own weapon spoke with the authority of federal justice, each shot carefully placed to maximum effect. But at 73, he didn't have the physical reserves of his younger companions, and the strain of the battle was beginning to tell. The evidence. He called out to Sarah as a bullet creased his shoulder and spun him partially around. "Whatever happens, get those documents to Denver." Jed felt a cold fury settle over him as he realized that Webb's men were specifically targeting his uncle, the one man whose testimony could tie together 40 years of accumulated evidence. This wasn't just an attempt to rescue Webb or eliminate witnesses. It was a calculated effort to destroy the last living. Linked to the original investigation, his father's service revolver seemed to aim itself as he engaged the attackers who were threatening James. The weapon had been designed for close-quarters combat, and at this range it was devastatingly effective. But ammunition was limited, and Webb's men seemed to have an endless supply of reinforcements working their way up the mountain slopes. Boone had dispatched his first opponent and was already engaging. A second when a rifle shot from somewhere in the trees caught him in the shoulder. The dog yelped in pain, but continued fighting, his loyalty transcending physical hurt in the way that only came from the deepest bonds between man and animal. "Boone!" Jed's voice carried a note of anguish that surprised him with its intensity. The dog had become more than just a companion. He was the living link to everything Jed valued about his simple mountain life. And seeing him wounded felt like losing another piece of his father's legacy. Frank had moved to a new position and was providing covering fire, while Sarah helped Uncle James bind his wounded shoulder. The old marshal was still functional, but the injury had slowed him down at a time when every second counted. Blood was soaking through the improvised bandage, and his face was growing pale from blood loss. "How many more?" Sarah asked, reloading her revolver with hands that shook only slightly despite the chaos surrounding them. "Too many," Jed replied honestly, taking stock of their tactical situation. They had accounted for perhaps 8 of Webb's men, but there were at least a dozen more moving through the forest, and more riders visible on the distant trails. Webb's entire organization was committed to this fight, understanding that failure meant the destruction of everything they had built. The second wave of attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing them to divide their attention and their limited ammunition. Webb's men had learned from the casualties of the first assault and were now using more sophisticated tactics, coordinating their movements and concentrating their fire on specific targets. A bullet struck the boulder inches from Sarah's head, showering her with granite chips and reminding everyone how precarious their position had become. The natural defenses that had seemed adequate for a small group of pursuers were insufficient against a coordinated assault by professional killers with military training. But it was Boone who provided the tactical insight that changed the character of the battle. Despite his wounded shoulder, the dog began moving in a specific pattern, not random evasion, but deliberate positioning that drew the attacker's attention away from the evidence and toward himself. His sacrifice was creating opportunities for his human companions to maneuver and engage more effectively. "He's herding them," Frank said with sudden understanding, "just like he would with livestock, pushing them toward a specific area where we can concentrate our fire." The realization transformed their defensive strategy from desperate survival to coordinated counterattack. Using Boone's positioning as a guide, they began to funnel Webb's men into a kill zone where the rocky terrain limited their mobility and exposed them to crossfire from multiple positions. Uncle James, despite his wound, was still capable of providing crucial intelligence about their opponent's likely tactics. "They'll try to take prisoners now," he warned. "Webb needs to know exactly what evidence we have and where else it might be hidden." The implications were chilling. Capture would mean torture and slow death, with Webb's men extracting every detail about the hidden caches and the network of federal contacts that had preserved the case for 40 years. But it also meant that their enemies might hesitate to use tactics that would kill them outright. A small advantage, but one that experienced fighters knew how to exploit. As the morning sun climbed higher, the battle settled into a deadly game of patience and precision. Webb's men had the advantage of numbers and fresh ammunition, but the defenders held the high ground and the desperate motivation of people fighting for something larger than their own lives. The service revolver in Jed's hands grew warm from repeated firing, but its weight remained reassuring, a tangible connection to his father's sense of duty and his uncle's lifetime of federal service. Each shot was fired not just in self-defense, but in the name of every honest person who had been cheated, intimidated, or killed by the Webb family's criminal empire. And through it all, Boone continued to fight with a courage that transcended his physical injuries, proving once again that loyalty was a force more powerful than fear or pain. The turning point came when the sound of distant bugles echoed across the mountainside, their clear notes cutting through the chaos of gunfire like a blade through silk. Uncle James raised his head from behind the boulder, a smile breaking across his weathered face despite the pain of his wounded shoulder. "Federal cavalry," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose careful planning had finally reached fruition. "I sent word to Fort Collins 3 days ago. Took them longer than expected to get here, but timing was never their strong suit." In his trembling hands, he held up a federal marshal's star, not the tarnished badge that Webb had carried as a trophy, but a new one, gleaming silver and brass that reflected the morning sun like a beacon of legitimate authority. This was the symbol that would finally bring federal justice to bear against 40 years of territorial corruption. The effect on Webb's men was immediate and devastating. Professional killers they might be, but facing federal cavalry was an entirely different proposition than eliminating a handful of witnesses on a remote mountain. The sound of organized military movement, horses, equipment, and disciplined soldiers changed the tactical situation completely. "Fall back," one of Webb's lieutenants shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield. regroup at the secondary position. But retreat was easier ordered than executed. The cavalry was approaching from multiple directions, having coordinated their assault to cut off the escape routes that Webb's men had counted on. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the professional confidence that had sustained them through the morning's battle began to crack under the pressure of military precision. Boone, despite his wounded shoulder, seemed to sense the change in momentum. The dog's tactical instincts, which had served them so well during the defensive phase of the battle, now shifted toward pursuit. His hackles were still raised, but his posture had changed from defensive alertness to aggressive hunting behavior. "Easy, boy," Jed said, reaching out to steady his faithful companion. "Let the cavalry do their job. You've done enough for one day." But even as he spoke, Jed realized that the dog's instincts were pointing toward something important. Boone wasn't just reacting to the retreating attackers. He was focused on something specific. A scent trail or sound that human senses couldn't detect. The first cavalry trooper to reach their position was a young lieutenant whose uniform showed the wear of hard riding and whose face carried the grim determination of a professional soldier executing orders. He dismounted quickly and approached Uncle James with the deference due to a senior federal official, Marshal Carter. He asked, though the family resemblance between the old lawman and Jed made identification unnecessary. "Lieutenant Morrison, 3rd Cavalry Regiment. We received your telegraph message and came as quickly as possible." The name Morrison sent a jolt of recognition through both Jed and Sarah. This was the son of Judge Samuel Morrison, the federal judge in Denver who had been waiting 40 years to see justice done in the Webb case. The cavalry officer's presence meant that the federal response to their situation involved the highest levels of territorial authority. "Lieutenant," Uncle James replied, struggling to his feet with Sarah's help, "your timing is impeccable. We have Marcus Webb in custody, along with evidence that will dismantle his entire criminal organization." But even as he spoke, the sound of gunfire from the surrounding forest indicated that the battle wasn't over. Webb's men were regrouping for a final desperate assault, understanding that capture by federal forces meant facing charges that could result in the death penalty. "How many hostiles?" Lieutenant Morrison asked, his professional demeanor shifting into combat readiness. "At least 30, probably more," Frank replied, reloading his Winchester with practiced efficiency. "Professional killers, well-armed and coordinated. They've been holding this territory like their personal kingdom for 40 years. The young cavalry officer nodded grimly. Military action against organized criminal enterprises was becoming increasingly common as the Western territories struggled to establish legitimate law and order. His men were trained and equipped for exactly this kind of operation. Sergeant Williams. He called out to a grizzled, non-commissioned officer who was positioning the cavalry troops in defensive formations. "Establish a perimeter and prepare for assault. These men are federal fugitives. Armed resistance should be met with appropriate force." But it was Webb himself who provided the most chilling insight into the situation they all faced. From his position under guard, the wealthy rancher watched the federal cavalry deployment with the calculating eye of a man who understood that his empire was crumbling, but wasn't prepared to surrender without exacting a price. "You think this ends it?" he called out, his voice carrying across the temporary calm that had settled over the battlefield. "My family has been building networks of influence for 2 generations. There are judges, territorial officials, and business leaders who owe their positions to Webb money and Webb favors." His words carried the ring of truth that made everyone uncomfortable. Corruption was a poison that had spread through many levels of territorial government, and dismantling it would require more than military force or legal warrants. "Even if you have evidence of my father's crimes," Webb continued, "proving current criminal conspiracy will be much more difficult. My lawyers are already preparing appeals and challenges that will tie up federal courts for years. Justice delayed is justice denied, Marshal Carter, and I have the resources to delay justice indefinitely." Uncle James looked down at the federal marshal's star in his hands. feeling the weight of 40 years of patient investigation and careful evidence gathering. But he also felt the weight of something else, the accumulated testimony of every victim who had suffered at Webb hands, every family that had been cheated out of their rightful inheritance. Perhaps, he said quietly. But you've made one critical error in your calculations, Mr. Webb, and what's that? The old marshal's smile was grim but satisfied. You assume that federal justice depends on territorial courts and local officials. But some crimes are so serious that they fall under direct federal jurisdiction. With trials held in Denver or even Washington, D.C., the implications hit Webb like a physical blow. Federal murder charges, especially those involving the death of a federal marshal, could be prosecuted anywhere in the territory where federal courts had jurisdiction. His network of local influence would be useless against federal prosecutors who operated outside the reach of territorial corruption. The evidence we've gathered doesn't just prove mining fraud, Uncle James continued. It proves conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of federal investigations, and systematic corruption of territorial officials. These are hanging offenses, Mr. Webb, and they'll be tried in courts where your money and influence carry no weight. As if to emphasize the point, the sound of additional cavalry units approaching from the east indicated that the federal response to Webb's crimes involved more resources than anyone had anticipated. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a coordinated federal operation designed to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise. Boone's continued alertness finally crystallized into specific action. The dog moved toward a section of forest where the sounds of retreat had been replaced by an ominous silence. His nose was working the air currents with the precision of an instrument designed for tracking, and his body language suggested that he had identified something that required immediate attention. There, Jed said, following his dog's focus. They're not retreating, they're repositioning for one final assault. Lieutenant Morrison raised his field glasses and studied the area Boone had indicated. What he saw there confirmed Jed's assessment and more. Webb's remaining men were preparing for a suicide attack, understanding that capture meant certain death but determined to take as many federal agents with them as possible. The federal marshal's star seemed to grow heavier in Uncle James's hands as he realized that justice, even when backed by military force and federal authority, still required brave men to stand against those who would corrupt it. The symbol of legitimate law enforcement had waited 40 years to be properly displayed. Now it would be tested in the crucible of men who recognized no authority except violence and feared nothing but the exposure of their crimes. 6 months later, the first stone of Jed Carter's new cabin was laid with ceremony befitting a man who had helped bring down one of the territory's most corrupt criminal enterprises. The foundation stone was carved from the same granite that had formed his original hearth, but this time it bore an inscription that would endure for generations. Jacob Carter, justice delayed but not denied, and below it James Carter, federal marshal, faithful unto death. Boone supervised the construction with the dignified authority of a dog who had proven his worth in the most decisive way possible. His wounded shoulder had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar that Sarah insisted made him look distinguished. The blue-tick hound had become something of a celebrity in Cedar Falls, with children begging their parents for stories about the dog who had helped uncover a $5 million treasure and brought down a criminal empire. The new cabin was larger than the old one, built with the kind of craftsmanship that came from having sufficient resources to do things properly. But more importantly, it was built as a home for 2 people rather than 1. Sarah Murphy had accepted Jed's proposal on Christmas morning, and their wedding was planned for the spring, when the mountain wildflowers would provide a natural cathedral worthy of their union. Judge Morrison had been as incorruptible as Jacob Carter had believed. The federal trial in Denver had resulted in convictions on multiple charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy that had sent Marcus Webb and 17 of his associates to federal prison for the rest of their lives. The remaining members of his organization had scattered to other territories, their network of corruption dismantled and their influence broken. Uncle James sat in a comfortable chair by the new fireplace, his federal marshal's badge displayed in a place of honor on the mantel. At 74, he had finally been able to close the case that had defined his entire career. But he had chosen to spend his remaining years in Colorado, close to the nephew who had helped him complete his life's work. "Read it again," he said, gesturing toward the letter that had arrived that morning from the Territorial Mining Office. Sarah unfolded the official document and read aloud in the formal tones appropriate to legal proclamation. By order of the Federal District Court of Colorado Territory, and pursuant to the evidence presented in the matter of Carter versus Webb, the Silver Creek Mining Partnership and all associated claims are hereby restored to their rightful owner, Jed Carter, heir to the estate of Jacob Carter. Total estimated value of mineral rights and associated properties, $5,700,000. The figure still seemed unreal, even after months of legal proceedings and expert testimony. Jed had gone from being a homeless mountain man to one of the wealthiest individuals in the territory, but the money itself mattered less than what it represented. Vindication for his father's memory and justice for every victim of the Webb family's crimes. "What will you do with it all?" Frank asked from his position near the window, where he was keeping a watchful eye on the approach road. Old habits died hard, and despite Webb's conviction, there were still men in the territory who held grudges against those who had brought down their former employer. Jed looked around at the people who had become his family. Sarah, whose courage had been essential to preserving the evidence. Frank, whose loyalty had never wavered during the dangerous journey. Uncle James, whose patient investigation had finally borne fruit. And Boone, whose instincts had guided them to the truth. This was wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or silver ore. "Some of it will go to the families Webb cheated over the years," he replied. "There are widows in this territory who lost everything when their husbands stood up to corruption. Some of it will fund a school for the children of Cedar Falls, and some will establish a trust to ensure that federal law enforcement has the resources it needs to investigate corruption, wherever it takes root. But the most important use of the Webb settlement. Money was already taking shape in the form of the new cabin and the life it represented. For the first time since childhood, Jed was building something with the confidence that it would endure, protected by legitimate law and surrounded by people who understood the difference between justice and revenge. Sarah moved to stand beside him as they watched the sun set over the peaks that had been his home for more than 60 years. Her presence was a constant reminder that some of life's greatest treasures couldn't be buried under hearthstones or hidden in mountain caches. They had to be discovered through the patient building of trust and shared experience. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The simple life you had before all this started?" Jed considered the question seriously, looking out over the valley where his original cabin had stood. That life had been peaceful in its way, free from the complications that came with wealth and public attention. But it had also been incomplete, built on foundations that he hadn't understood, and carrying the weight of injustices that had never been addressed. "No," he said finally. "My father spent his entire life carrying the burden of stolen dreams and denied justice. Uncle James spent 40 years building a case that most people would have given up on after 40 days. That kind of dedication deserves to bear fruit, even if it takes longer than anyone expected." Boone had taken his usual position on the new porch, but his alertness was different now, the relaxed watchfulness of a dog whose territory was secure and whose pack was safe. The hound's presence was a living reminder of the loyalty and instincts that had made their victory possible, qualities that transcended the simple relationship between man and animal. As darkness settled over the mountains, lanterns were lit in the windows of the new cabin, sending warm yellow light across the clearing where Jacob Carter had once built his own dreams of a better life. The light was a beacon that could be seen from the valley below, a signal that this particular corner of Colorado Territory was under the protection of people who understood the difference between justice and convenience. Uncle James dozed by the fireplace, the federal marshal's badge catching the light from the flames in the same way it had caught sunlight on that morning when federal authority had finally arrived to confront territorial corruption. At his feet lay a small wooden box, not the one that had held Jacob's evidence, but a new one containing letters from grateful families whose own injustices had been addressed using the Webb settlement money. "Tomorrow," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Jed's, "we start planning the spring planting. Frank thinks the soil near the creek will support a proper vegetable garden, maybe even some fruit trees." The conversation turned to the mundane details of building a life, crops and livestock, neighbors and weather, the 1,000 small decisions that transformed a house into a home. But underneath the ordinary planning lay the extraordinary foundation of people who had risked everything for principles that couldn't be bought or sold. As the evening deepened, Boone rose from his position on the porch and made his customary patrol of the property boundaries. The dog's route took him past the spot where the original cabin had stood, now marked only by the stone foundation that would serve as the base for Sarah's planned flower garden. But the hound's attention wasn't focused on the past. It was alert to the sounds and scents of the present. The responsibility of guarding a future that had been purchased with courage and preserved through loyalty. The new cabin's foundation stone, carved with the names of 2 generations of Carter men who had served justice in their own ways, would endure long after everyone present had passed into memory. But the real foundation of their victory lay in the bonds between people who had chosen to stand together when standing alone would have been safer, and in the patient faith that justice, however long delayed, would ultimately prevail over the corruption that sought to destroy it. In the quiet of the mountain evening, with the warmth of firelight and the comfort of friends, Jed Carter understood that he had finally found the treasure his father had really intended for him to discover, not silver hidden under stones, but the knowledge that some things in life were worth fighting for, and some people were worth standing beside when the fighting became necessary.